It was a typical Thursday afternoon in the bustling downtown district of the city. The streets were filled with the sounds of honking horns, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional siren in the distance. However, one particular scene was about to unfold that would soon grab the attention of the entire community. In a quiet alleyway behind a popular local business, a well-dressed man in his 50s stood patiently, seemingly lost in thought. His name was Michael, and he was a respected member of the community, known for his philanthropic efforts and his unwavering commitment to making a difference in the lives of those around him. Unbeknownst to Michael, a concerned citizen had called the police, reporting a suspicious-looking man loitering in the alleyway. The caller, a young woman who worked at the nearby office, had noticed Michael and assumed he was up to no good, given the secluded location. Within minutes, two police officers, freshly graduated from the academy, arrived on the scene, their sirens blaring and lights flashing. They quickly spotted Michael and approached him, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Sir, can you please state your name and reason for being in this alleyway?" The senior officer, Officer Johnson, demanded in a stern voice. Michael, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation, hesitated for a moment before responding. "My name is Michael, and I'm just taking a moment to myself before heading back to my office. Is there a problem, officer?" Officer Johnson's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a quick glance with his partner, Officer Williams. "We received a call about a suspicious individual in this area. You matched the description, and we need to verify your identity and why you're here." Michael, sensing the officer's growing tension, tried to remain calm and cooperative. "I understand you're just doing your job, officers, but I assure you there's no need for concern. I work in the building just down the street, and I often come out here to clear my head during my lunch break." However, the officers were not convinced. They began to barrage Michael with a series of questions, growing increasingly aggressive in their tone and body language. "If you work nearby, then why are you back here in this alley?" Officer Williams asked, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "I told you, I come here to get away from the hustle and bustle for a few minutes," Michael replied, his voice remaining level despite the officer's intimidating demeanor. "That's awfully convenient. You expect us to just take your word for it?" Officer Johnson interjected, his hand now gripping the handle of his holstered weapon. The tension in the alleyway was palpable, and Michael could sense that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He tried to reason with the officers, but his pleas for understanding fell on deaf ears. Suddenly, without warning, the two officers seized Michael, roughly grabbing his arms and pushing him against the wall. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Officer Johnson barked, as he and his partner proceeded to slam Michael to the ground and pin him down. Michael struggled to comprehend what was happening, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Please, officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not resisting, I'm just trying to." "Shut up and stop resisting," Officer Williams shouted, cutting Michael off mid-sentence. The officers then proceeded to tie Michael's hands behind his back, securing him to a nearby metal pole with a length of rope. As Michael sat there, his wrists chafing against the rough rope, he couldn't help but wonder how a simple lunchtime break had escalated into this dire situation. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet the officers were clearly convinced that he was some sort of criminal, intent on causing trouble in their community. The sounds of the bustling city seemed to fade into the background as Michael's focus narrowed to the two police officers standing over him, their expressions a mix of triumph and indignation. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of helplessness and frustration, wondering how he would ever convince these officers of his innocence. Little did Michael know, however, that the true nature of this encounter was about to be revealed in a way that would send shockwaves through the entire community. As Michael sat helplessly tied to the metal pole, his wrists chafing against the rough rope, a growing sense of frustration and indignation began to overtake him. He couldn't believe that these two young police officers, who were supposed to uphold the law and protect the community, were treating him in such a harsh and demeaning manner. The officers, seemingly emboldened by the fact that they had subdued and restrained their suspect, began to unleash a barrage of verbal abuse and humiliation upon the hapless Michael. Well, look what we have here," Officer Johnson sneered, circling Michael like a predator toying with its prey. "Thought you could outsmart us, did you? We don't take kindly to troublemakers in this neighborhood." Michael tried to reason with the officers, his voice remaining calm and level despite the tumultuous situation. Officers, please, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not a troublemaker. I'm simply a man taking a break during my workday. I work in the building just down the street, and I. But his pleas fell on deaf ears as Officer Williams quickly interrupted him. Save it, pal. We've heard it all before. You're nothing but a lying, good-for-nothing criminal, and we're going to make sure you get what's coming to you. The two officers then proceeded to mock and belittle Michael, making derogatory comments about his appearance, his perceived social status, and his overall character. They even went so far as to spit in his face, eliciting a gasp of shock and horror from the nearby bystanders who had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. As the humiliation continued, Michael could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He desperately wanted to break free from his restraints and confront the officers, to assert his innocence and demand that they treat him with the respect and dignity he deserved. But the more he struggled, the tighter the ropes became, and the more the officers seemed to revel in his helplessness. Suddenly, a woman's voice rang out from the crowd, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Stop! What are you doing to that man? This is outrageous." The officers whirled around to see a well-dressed woman, her face a mask of horror and disbelief, pushing her way through the growing crowd. It was Michael's wife, Sophia, who had been out running errands and had stumbled upon the horrific scene unfolding in the alleyway. Sophia rushed to her husband's side, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and fury. "Michael, what's happening here? Who are these officers, and why have they done this to you?" Officer Johnson, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of this unexpected advocate, faltered for a moment. "Ma'am, this man is under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. We received a call about a suspicious individual in this area, and he refused to cooperate with our investigation." But Sophia was having none of it. Obstruction of justice? Resisting arrest? "This is my husband, Michael, a pillar of this community. You would never do such a thing. You've made a terrible mistake, and I demand that you release him immediately." The officers, sensing the growing tension and the potential for the situation to spiral out of control, exchanged a brief, uneasy glance. They knew that they had acted hastily and without proper justification, but their pride and sense of authority had blinded them to the truth. As the bystanders around them began to murmur in agreement with Sophia's demands, the officers realized that they might have bitten off more than they could chew. The question now was, how would they extricate themselves from this increasingly volatile situation without further damaging their already tarnished reputations? As the tense standoff unfolded in the alleyway, with Sophia passionately defending her husband and the two officers struggling to maintain their composure, a growing sense of unease began to permeate the crowd of onlookers. The bystanders, initially drawn to the scene by the commotion, now found themselves caught up in the unfolding drama, unsure of how to react or what to make of the situation. Some expressed outrage at the officers' apparent abuse of power, while others remained skeptical, wondering if there was more to the story than met the eye. Sophia, her eyes burning with a mix of determination and anguish, continued to plead with the officers to release her husband. "This is a terrible mistake. Michael is a respected member of our community, a philanthropist who has dedicated his life to helping others. He would never do anything to warrant this kind of treatment." The officers, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the growing scrutiny, exchanged another uneasy glance. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job here. This man was acting suspiciously, and we had to take appropriate action. If he's truly who you say he is, then we'll need to verify his identity and investigate further." But before the officers could make another move, a sudden realization dawned on Sophia, and her eyes widened with a mixture of shock and understanding. "Wait a minute. Michael, is that really you?" Michael, his face a mask of humiliation and despair, nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Sophia, it's me. I'm so sorry you had to see this." Sophia's expression quickly transformed from one of concern to one of sheer disbelief. But how can this be? These officers don't know who you are." The officers, now thoroughly confused by the sudden turn of events, watched on in silence as Sophia's demeanor shifted. "Michael, you're the chairman of the local community foundation. You've been honored by the mayor for your tireless efforts to improve the lives of underprivileged children in our city. How could these officers not recognize you? The crowd, which had been murmuring and shifting uncomfortably, now erupted into a collective gasp of astonishment. The realization that the man they had witnessed being humiliated and restrained was, in fact, a highly respected community leader sent shockwaves through the crowd, and the officers found themselves the target of a growing chorus of outrage and condemnation. Officer Johnson, his face flushed with embarrassment, tried to stammer out an explanation. We had no idea. The call we received simply described a suspicious individual, and we had to respond accordingly. We didn't mean to. But Sophia cut him off, her voice dripping with a combination of anger and disbelief. Didn't mean to? You tied up and humiliated a man who has dedicated his life to helping others in this community. How could you not have recognized him? This is an outrage, and I demand that you release him immediately and apologize for your actions. The officers, now visibly shaken by the turn of events, quickly untied the ropes that bound Michael to the pole. As he stood up, rubbing his sore wrists, the crowd surged forward, offering words of support and sympathy. Some even reached out to shake his hand, their expressions a mix of outrage and admiration. Michael, his composure slowly returning, surveyed the scene with a heavy heart. He had never imagined that a simple lunchtime break would have escalated into such a public and humiliating ordeal. But as he looked around at the faces of the concerned citizens who had rallied to his defense, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude for the community he had worked so hard to serve. The officers, realizing the gravity of their mistake, stood awkwardly to the side, their heads bowed in shame. They knew that this incident would have far-reaching consequences, not only for their own reputations but for the entire police department's relationship with the community. As the crowd began to disperse, Sophia gently took Michael's arm, leading him away from the scene. "Come, my love," she said softly. "Let's go home. We have some important matters to discuss." Michael nodded, his mind already whirring with questions and concerns about the ramifications of this incident. He knew that this was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter that would test the very fabric of the community he held so dear. News of the incident in the alleyway spread like wildfire through the community, igniting a firestorm of outrage and condemnation. Within hours, the story had become the talk of the town, with local news outlets scrambling to cover the developing events. As the details of the encounter between Michael, the respected community leader, and the two young police officers began to emerge, the public's reaction was swift and unequivocal. People took to social media, expressing their shock and disbelief at the officers' actions and calling for immediate accountability and change. "How could this happen?" Read one impassioned tweet. "Michael is a pillar of our community, and he was treated like a common criminal. This is a disgrace." Another post, shared thousands of times, read, "We entrust our police officers to protect and serve, not to humiliate and abuse. This is a clear violation of Michael's civil rights, and it cannot be tolerated." The outrage quickly spilled over into the real world as local civil rights groups and community activists began to organize protests and rallies demanding a thorough investigation into the incident. "This is not just about Michael," said Sarah, the leader of the local ACLU chapter. "This is about the systemic issues of racial bias and excessive force within our police department. We've seen too many instances of officers mistreating members of our community, and it has to stop." The protesters gathered in the alleyway where the incident had occurred, holding signs that read "Justice for Michael" and "End Police Brutality." The crowd, which grew larger with each passing day, chanted slogans and called for the immediate suspension and termination of the two officers involved. Meanwhile, the police department found itself in the unenviable position of having to respond to the growing public outcry. Faced with mounting pressure from community leaders and the media, the department's leadership was forced to take immediate action. "We take these allegations very seriously," said the police chief in a hastily arranged press conference. "We will be conducting a thorough and impartial investigation into the actions of the officers involved. If any wrongdoing is found, they will be held accountable." However, the community was not satisfied with this tepid response. Many felt that the department was simply trying to buy time and deflect the criticism, rather than taking concrete steps to address the underlying issues. "An investigation is not enough," said Reverend Jackson, a respected local faith leader. "We need to see immediate consequences for these officers' actions. Anything less than that will be seen as a betrayal of the community's trust. The calls for action only grew louder and more insistent as the days passed. Local civil rights groups organized town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and share their own experiences of mistreatment by the police. The stories that emerged were both heartbreaking and infuriating, painting a picture of a department that had long struggled with issues of bias, excessive force, and a lack of accountability. "This isn't about one incident," said Sophia, Michael's wife, during a particularly impassioned town hall meeting. "This is about a systemic problem that has been allowed to fester for far too long. Our community deserves better, and we will not rest until we see real change." The growing chorus of voices demanding justice and reform put the police department under immense pressure. With the media attention and public scrutiny intensifying with each passing day, the department's leadership knew that it could no longer afford to ignore the community's concerns. As the investigation into the incident involving Michael continued, the department was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that this was just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a much larger problem that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The question now was, how would the department respond? Would they be willing to take the necessary steps to address the deeply rooted issues of bias and excessive force, or would they continue to defend the status quo and risk further alienating the very community they were sworn to protect and serve? The fate of the department, and perhaps the entire community, hung in the balance. As the outrage and demands for justice continued to reverberate throughout the community, the city's police department found itself in a position of increasing pressure and scrutiny. The incident involving Michael, the respected community leader, had become the focal point of a much larger debate about the department's handling of interactions with the public, particularly when it came to issues of race and excessive force. The police chief, a seasoned and respected law enforcement veteran, knew that he could no longer afford to remain silent or defensive. The community's trust had been severely eroded, and he understood that meaningful change was necessary if the department was to regain its credibility and standing. In a hastily arranged press conference, the chief addressed the media and the concerned citizens who had gathered to hear his response. "I want to start by acknowledging the pain and outrage that this incident has caused within our community," the chief began, his voice somber and sincere. "What happened to Mr. Michael was unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values and standards that we strive for in this department." The chief went on to explain that the two officers involved in the incident, Johnson and Williams, have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a thorough internal investigation. "We take these allegations very seriously, and we will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to determine exactly what transpired and whether any policies or procedures were violated," the chief said. "If the investigation reveals wrongdoing, I can assure you that the officers will face appropriate disciplinary action." However, the community members in attendance were not entirely satisfied with this response. Many felt that the department was simply trying to placate the public and avoid taking meaningful action. "That's all well and good, Chief," said Sarah, the ACLU leader, "but we've heard these kinds of promises before. What concrete steps are you taking to address the underlying issues of racial bias and excessive force within your department?" The chief paused for a moment, recognizing the validity of the question. "You're absolutely right, Miss Sarah. This incident has shown a light on problems that have existed within our department for far too long. That's why we're committed to implementing a comprehensive review of our training programs, use of force policies, and internal accountability measures." The chief went on to explain that the department would be working closely with community leaders and independent experts to develop a plan for reform and rehabilitation. This would include mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, the creation of a civilian oversight board to review complaints and incidents, and the establishment of a dedicated community outreach and engagement unit. "We understand that trust has been severely eroded, and we know that it will take time and sustained effort to rebuild that trust," the chief acknowledged. "But I want to assure you that we are fully committed to this process, and we will not rest until we have addressed the issues that have led to incidents like the one involving Mr. Michael." The community members in attendance seemed cautiously optimistic, but many remained skeptical, having witnessed similar promises of reform in the past that had ultimately fallen short. "Actions speak louder than words, Chief," said Reverend Jackson. "We'll be watching closely to ensure that you and your department follow through on these commitments. The well-being of our community depends on it." The chief nodded solemnly, aware that the burden of proof was now on his department to demonstrate its sincerity and willingness to enact meaningful change. As the press conference came to a close, the chief could feel the weight of the responsibility resting squarely on his shoulders. The incident involving Michael had become a pivotal moment, not just for the department, but for the entire community. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: failure was not an option. With a renewed sense of purpose and determination, the chief knew that the hard work of rebuilding trust and restoring the community's faith in its police force was only just beginning. As the fallout from the incident in the alleyway continued to reverberate through the community, all eyes turned to Michael, the man at the center of the controversy. The respected community leader and philanthropist had been thrust into the spotlight, his once private life now the subject of intense public scrutiny and debate. In the days following the confrontation with the police officers, Michael had retreated from the public eye, preferring to process the traumatic event in the privacy of his own home. But as the pressure mounted and the demands for accountability grew, he knew that he could no longer remain silent. Summoning his courage, Michael agreed to sit down for an exclusive interview with a local news station, determined to share his perspective and shed light on the deeper issues at play. "I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that day," Michael began, his voice calm and measured. "I was simply taking a moment to myself, as I often do during my lunch break, when those officers approached me and began to interrogate me." Michael went on to describe the escalating confrontation, the humiliation he felt as he was forcibly restrained and tied to the pole, and the utter disbelief he experienced when he realized that the officers had no idea who he was. "I kept trying to explain to them that I was not a criminal, that I was simply a member of the community taking a break," Michael recounted, his brow furrowing with a mix of frustration and sadness. "But they refused to listen, and they treated me like I was some kind of threat to their authority." The interviewer, a seasoned journalist, could sense the weight of Michael's words, the profound disappointment and sense of betrayal that had taken root within him. "As a lifelong resident of this city, as someone who has dedicated countless hours and resources to improving the lives of those in need, I never imagined that I would be subjected to such treatment by the very people who are supposed to protect and serve our community," Michael said, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. The interviewer then asked Michael about the broader implications of the incident and how it had affected his view of the relationship between the police department and the community. "This isn't just about me," Michael responded, his gaze unwavering. "This is about a systemic problem that has been allowed to fester for far too long. The lack of accountability, the issue of racial bias, the use of excessive force, these are all deeply ingrained issues that have eroded the public's trust in law enforcement." Michael went on to explain that the incident had shaken his faith in the very institutions he had worked so hard to support and uplift. He expressed a deep sense of disappointment and disillusionment, not just with the individual officers involved, but with the broader culture and mindset that had allowed such behavior to take root. "I'm not asking for special treatment or preferential treatment," Michael said, his voice tinged with a newfound resolve. "I'm simply asking for the same basic dignity and respect that every member of this community deserves. And if the police department is unwilling or unable to provide that, then we have a much bigger problem on our hands." The interview concluded with Michael reiterating his commitment to working with community leaders and advocates to drive meaningful change within the police department. He vowed to use his platform and influence to ensure that the incident involving him would not be swept under the rug, but rather serve as a catalyst for long overdue reforms and a renewed sense of trust and accountability. As the interview aired, the public's response was overwhelmingly supportive. Accolades and messages of solidarity poured in from across the city, with many praising Michael's courage, his commitment to the community, and his unwavering pursuit of justice. For Michael, the road ahead was undoubtedly a daunting one, but he knew that the time for change had come. The fate of the community he loved so dearly hung in the balance, and he was determined to do everything in his power to ensure that justice would prevail. In the wake of the explosive interview with Michael, the respected community leader and philanthropist, the police department found itself under immense pressure to take swift and decisive action. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, with demands for accountability and meaningful change echoing throughout the city. The internal investigation into the incident involving Michael had been underway for several weeks, with the department's leadership carefully combing through the evidence and testimony of the officers involved. But as the findings began to emerge, it became increasingly clear that the issues extended far beyond the actions of a single patrol team. The investigation uncovered a pattern of excessive force, racial bias, and a lack of accountability within the department as a whole. Officers were found to have used disproportionate levels of violence in their interactions with minority community members, often resorting to physical restraint and intimidation tactics, even in situations that did not warrant such measures. Moreover, the review of the department's internal disciplinary records revealed a troubling trend. Complaints and allegations of misconduct were routinely dismissed or downplayed, with officers facing little to no consequences for their actions. As the damning evidence came to light, the police chief, who had initially promised a thorough and impartial investigation, found himself in a difficult position. Facing mounting public pressure and the threat of legal action, he knew that he could no longer simply sweep the issue under the rug. In a hastily arranged press conference, the chief announced the termination of the 2 officers involved in the incident with Michael, as well as the suspension of several additional officers pending further disciplinary action. "The findings of our investigation are deeply disturbing," the chief said, his expression somber. "The actions of these officers, as well as the broader systemic issues within our department, have eroded the public's trust, and that is unacceptable." The announcement was met with a mix of relief and skepticism from the community members in attendance. Many welcomed the decision to hold the officers accountable, but they remained doubtful that this was truly a comprehensive solution to the deeper problems plaguing the department. "This is a good first step, but it's just the tip of the iceberg," said Sarah, the ACLU leader who had been at the forefront of the community's demands for reform. "We need to see a complete overhaul of the department's policies, training programs, and internal review processes. Anything less than that will not be enough to restore the trust that has been so severely damaged." The chief acknowledged the validity of Sarah's concerns, promising that the department would be working closely with community leaders, independent experts, and civil rights organizations to develop a comprehensive plan for meaningful and sustainable change. "We understand that words alone are not enough," the chief said. "That is why we are committed to implementing a series of sweeping reforms, from mandatory de-escalation training to the creation of a civilian oversight board to review complaints and incidents." However, the process of enacting these reforms would prove to be a long and arduous one, fraught with political and bureaucratic challenges. The police department, which had long operated with a degree of autonomy and insulation from public scrutiny, now found itself under the microscope, its every move and decision scrutinized by a community that had grown weary of broken promises and half measures. As the weeks turned into months, the public's patience began to wear thin. Calls for the chief's resignation and the complete dismantling of the department grew louder, fueled by a growing sense of frustration and disillusionment. For Michael, the aftermath of the incident had taken a personal toll. He had hoped that his willingness to speak out and demand accountability would spark real change, but as the wheels of bureaucracy continued to turn, he found himself increasingly disillusioned and discouraged. "I thought that by sharing my story, I could be a catalyst for the kind of transformation our community so desperately needs," Michael said in a somber interview. "But it's becoming clear that the system is deeply entrenched, and that real change will require an even greater fight than I had anticipated." Despite the setbacks and the mounting challenges, Michael remained resolute in his determination to see the process through. He knew that the fate of the community he loved hung in the balance, and he was unwilling to accept anything less than true, lasting reform. The road ahead was uncertain, but Michael was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that the incident he had endured would not be in vain, that it would serve as a catalyst for the kind of sweeping changes that would make a tangible difference in the lives of all who called this community home. In the months that followed the fallout from the incident involving Michael, the respected community leader and philanthropist, the city's police department found itself under intense scrutiny and pressure to enact meaningful change. The termination of the 2 officers directly involved in the confrontation was just the first step in a much larger and more complex process of reform and rehabilitation. With the public's trust in the department at an all-time low, the leadership knew that they needed to take drastic measures to regain the community's confidence. Under the guidance of independent experts and community leaders, the department embarked on a comprehensive review of its policies, training programs, and internal disciplinary processes. This included the implementation of mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, as well as the creation of a civilian oversight board to review complaints and incidents of alleged misconduct. "We understand that words alone are not enough," said the police chief, who had taken a more hands-on approach to the reform efforts. "That's why we're committed to tangible, sustainable changes that will transform the way our officers interact with the community they serve." One of the key initiatives was the establishment of a dedicated community engagement unit, tasked with building bridges between the police force and the diverse neighborhoods that made up the city. Officers in this unit were required to undergo extensive training in cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, and community-oriented policing. "Our goal is to foster a sense of partnership and mutual understanding between the police and the people we're sworn to protect," explained Lieutenant Garcia, who had been chosen to lead the new unit. "We want to move away from the us versus them mentality and instead work together to address the issues that matter most to our community." As part of this effort, the department organized a series of town hall meetings and listening sessions where residents could voice their concerns, share their experiences, and provide input on the reform process. Michael, the catalyst for these changes, was an active participant in these discussions, using his platform and influence to advocate for the kind of transformative reforms he believed were necessary. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Michael said during one particularly impassioned town hall. "This is about creating a system that works for everyone, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status, or their relationship with law enforcement. We all deserve to feel safe and respected in our own neighborhoods." The town hall meetings were often tense and emotionally charged, with community members expressing a wide range of perspectives and experiences. Some were cautiously optimistic about the department's reform efforts, while others remained deeply skeptical, unwilling to trust that the changes would be meaningful or lasting. However, as the process continued, a sense of cautious optimism began to emerge. Residents witnessed the department's genuine commitment to engaging with the community, listening to their concerns, and implementing concrete changes to address the issues that have been plaguing the city for far too long. One particularly significant moment came when the police chief, accompanied by a group of department leaders, visited Michael's office to formally apologize for the incident that had sparked the entire process. "Mr. Michael, on behalf of the men and women of this department, I want to express our deepest regret and sincerest apologies for the way you were treated," the chief said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What happened to you was unacceptable, and it's a clear indication of the systemic problems we've been working to address." Michael, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude, accepted the apology graciously, acknowledging the department's efforts to make amends and move the community forward. "I appreciate your candor, Chief, and I'm encouraged by the steps you and your team have taken to enact meaningful change," Michael responded. "But I also know that this is just the beginning. We have a long way to go, and I'll be here, working alongside you and the community to ensure that the reforms you put in place are sustained and effective." The exchange was a powerful symbol of the evolving relationship between the police department and the community it served. It was a testament to the power of dialogue, empathy, and a shared commitment to creating a more just and equitable society. As the reform efforts continued to unfold, Michael and other community leaders worked tirelessly to support the department, offering guidance, resources, and a critical eye to ensure that the progress made was lasting and impactful. The road ahead was still long and arduous, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope that the city could emerge from this crisis stronger, more united, and better equipped to address the deep-rooted issues that had plagued it for far too long. As the months and years passed, the incident involving Michael, the respected community leader and philanthropist, became a distant memory for many. The reforms and changes implemented by the city's police department had slowly but surely begun to bear fruit, with a noticeable improvement in the department's relationship with the community it served. Michael, however, remained deeply invested in the progress of the ongoing transformation. He continued to serve as a vocal advocate, working tirelessly alongside community leaders and activists to ensure that the momentum for change was sustained. One of Michael's most significant contributions was the establishment of a new nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering positive interactions between the police and the community. The organization, aptly named Bridging the Gap, aimed to provide training, resources, and support to both law enforcement and community members, with the ultimate goal of building a foundation of trust and understanding. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Michael said during the organization's inaugural press conference. "It's about ensuring that no one else in our community has to endure the kind of humiliation and injustice that I experienced. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to create a system that works for everyone." The organization's programs were wide-ranging, from implicit bias training for officers to community-led conflict resolution workshops. It also established a mentorship program, pairing officers with local youth, fostering positive relationships and breaking down the barriers that had long divided the community. Michael's unwavering commitment to the cause was evident in the countless hours he devoted to the organization, leveraging his extensive network of contacts and resources to secure funding, partnerships, and support from across the city. "Michael is a true hero in our community," said Sophia, his wife, who had stood by his side throughout the ordeal. "His willingness to put himself out there, to share his story, and fight for change has inspired so many people to get involved and make a difference." Indeed, Michael's story had become a rallying cry for those seeking to tackle the systemic issues of racial bias and excessive force within law enforcement. His name and face had become synonymous with the fight for justice and accountability, his legacy extending far beyond the boundaries of his own community. As the organization grew and its impact became more pronounced, Michael found himself increasingly in the public eye. He was regularly invited to speak at conferences and forums, sharing his insights and experiences with audiences across the country. "I never sought out this kind of attention," Michael acknowledged in one interview. "But if my story can be used as a catalyst for change, then I'm more than willing to lend my voice to the cause." Michael's unwavering commitment to the community and his tireless efforts to bridge the gap between the police and the people they serve did not go unnoticed. In a touching ceremony attended by the mayor, city council members, and a host of community leaders, Michael was honored with the city's highest civic award, recognizing his lifelong dedication to making his community a better place. Michael's story is one of resilience, courage, and a deep, abiding love for the city he calls home, the mayor said during the ceremony. He has not only weathered the storm, but he has emerged as a beacon of hope, inspiring us all to work towards a more just and equitable society. As Michael accepted the award, his eyes shone with a mixture of pride and humility. He knew that this was not just about him, but about the countless individuals who had stood by his side, fought alongside him, and believed in the power of collective action to drive meaningful change. In the years that followed, Michael continued to dedicate himself to the mission of bridging the gap, using his influence and resources to expand the organization's reach and impact. He mentored young community leaders, forged partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the region, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms enacted in his own city were replicated and sustained in others. Michael's legacy, woven into the fabric of the community he loved so dearly, would endure long after he was gone. He had proven that one person, armed with the power of resilience, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice, could indeed make a profound and lasting difference in the world. As the years passed and the reforms enacted by the city's police department continued to take hold, the incident involving Michael, the respected community leader and philanthropist, became a powerful symbol of the change that was possible when a community came together to demand accountability and justice. The story of Michael's ordeal and the subsequent transformation of the police force had reverberated far beyond the boundaries of the city, becoming a case study in the importance of addressing systemic issues of racial bias, excessive force, and a lack of community trust. What happened to Michael was a wake-up call, not just for our department, but for law enforcement agencies across the country, said the police chief, who had overseen the majority of the reform efforts. It showed us that we couldn't continue to operate in a vacuum, disconnected from the very people we were sworn to protect and serve. The changes implemented in the wake of the incident were wide-ranging and far-reaching. In addition to the mandatory de-escalation training and the creation of the Civilian Oversight Board, the department had also restructured its recruitment and hiring practices, placing a greater emphasis on candidates who demonstrated a genuine commitment to community-oriented policing. We realized that simply reacting to incidents of misconduct wasn't enough, the chief explained. We needed to be proactive in building a force that was reflective of the community and that understood the unique challenges and needs of the people they served. The results of these efforts were palpable. Complaints of excessive force and racial bias dropped significantly, and the department's relationship with the community began to mend, with residents once again feeling a sense of trust and confidence in their local law enforcement. Michael, who had remained deeply involved in the reform process, was heartened to see the progress that had been made. However, he also knew that the work was far from over, and that the fragile trust that had been rebuilt could easily be shattered if the department failed to maintain its commitment to change. This is not just about one incident or one community, Michael said in a speech to a group of community leaders and activists. This is about a national reckoning with the deep-rooted issues of racism, bias, and abuse of power that have plagued law enforcement for far too long. Michael's words resonated with the audience, many of whom had experienced similar incidents of mistreatment and injustice at the hands of the police. They recognized the importance of using Michael's story as a catalyst for broader, systemic change, a change that would require sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been allowed to fester for generations. In the years that followed, Michael continued to lend his voice and his influence to the ongoing fight for police reform and community empowerment. He worked tirelessly alongside civil rights groups, faith leaders, and elected officials to push for legislative changes, increased funding for training and community programs, and the implementation of robust accountability measures. At the same time, Michael's own organization, Bridging the Gap, had grown into a national network, with chapters established in cities across the country. The organization's programs and initiatives had become a model for communities seeking to rebuild trust and foster meaningful collaboration between law enforcement and the people they serve. As Michael neared the end of his life, he reflected on the journey he had undertaken, the challenges he had faced, and the lasting impact he hoped to leave behind. When this all started, I never imagined that my story would become a catalyst for such sweeping change, Michael said in a final interview. But I also knew that I couldn't stay silent, that I had to use my voice and my influence to fight for the kind of justice and equity that every member of our community deserves. Michael's legacy would continue to inspire and guide the ongoing efforts to transform the criminal justice system and create a more just, equitable, and compassionate society. His story had become a rallying cry, a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. As the city and the nation mourned the loss of this exceptional individual, they also celebrated his life and the enduring impact of his work. Michael's name and his story had become synonymous with the fight for a better, more just tomorrow, a future where no one would ever have to endure the kind of humiliation and injustice that he had experienced on that fateful day in the alleyway.